Hello class. Today we are going to review chapter 11, which is titled Sentencing. It's a very good chapter. It's quite lengthy. There's a lot of information that you need to review. And again, we're looking for a lot of terminology and how the sentencing structure works. So we're going to cover most of this today in this PowerPoint. And there are some things that you'll need to read on your own, especially some of the issues in the chapter that we're going to let you know about. So, sentencing. That is the imposition of a penalty on a person convicted of a crime. It can be one of the most difficult decisions that's made by a judge or a jury because obviously it affects the fate of the defendant, can change their life, and it's supposed to achieve a diversity of goals. And we're going to go over some of the goals of sentencing. These are the goals and purposes the book lays out, and they do a pretty good job of it. And we're going to go over each of these. So make sure you know these goals and then the purpose of the goals. And again, we're going to go over these in detail right now, but just make sure you read these, understand them, about why we have them, and what's the purpose, okay? So first is retribution. Basically, this is an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, as stated in the Bible, and it's the oldest known type of sanction or sentence. And it's basically a type of vengeance that is put upon somebody. And again, it's the just deserts model of sentencing. They're responsible for their crimes. Their punishment is deserved and justified and required. So retribution. What type of sentences do we have for retribution today? What do you think? Do you think prison is retribution? Is that an eye for an eye? Is that doing somebody the same harm that they did to someone else? Really, the only retribution type of punishment we have today is the death penalty. And it's not used very often. We'll talk about that a little bit. Second, we have incapacitation. That's basically putting somebody somewhere locked up so they do not harm society. And this is the tough policy of getting tough on crime. If people continue to commit crimes in the public and commit crimes on the community, then you need to take them out of the community and lock them up. And basically this is how a lot of people end up in prison and jail, because they cannot get along in the community, and thus they are incapacitated away from the community. Then we have deterrence. There's two types. There's specific and general. And deterrence is a type of sanction that is supposed to inhibit criminal behavior by fear of punishment. So specific deterrence focuses on the offender, and general deterrence focuses on others who have not yet been arrested. So say somebody continues to commit burglaries. They may be sentenced just because of that, and they're going to focus on the offender. Due to the fact that you've continued to commit these crimes, we're going to try to deter you from doing this again by sentencing you to 2 years in prison. General deterrence, though, is used for other people that have not been arrested for the crime. So it sets an example of what can happen to you, okay? This type of sanction, deterrence, is very difficult to measure. The effectiveness, very difficult to measure. Next, we have rehabilitation. That is not a sentence, but it's more or less a program to reform a criminal. And most criminals can be reformed if they choose to. Some people that commit crimes, maybe they have a disease or mental issues. But rehabilitation is a bunch of programs that are there to help somebody. And sometimes that's all people need, is just a little rehabilitation to change their lives and not commit crimes. Restoration is kind of a new thing that's been going on in the past 15 years. And basically it attempts to make the victim whole again. It restores the victim to their prior state. Restoration is used a lot with the juveniles as a way to weed them out of the system. And it basically has the juvenile meet with the victim of their crime and discuss why they did it, maybe pay a fine, pay them back for the damage that they've done to try to make the victim whole again. So some of you, when you graduate, will be working for restorative justice programs. So it's a kind of a big deal. It's not as popular here as it is in some other countries, but restorative justice is a type of sanction. An indeterminate sentence is basically something that is less than imprisonment and more than a fine. And basically the judge has discretion of doing this. And the indeterminate sentence can be usually involving a rehabilitation program. And it can be AA meetings or NA meetings or counseling or family reunification. So the intermediate sentencing is there to basically help somebody. Structured sentencing, that's basically 2 years, 6 years, 8 years in prison or a jail term. But the sentencing principles look at the proportionality of the severity of the sanctions. It has to directly relate to the seriousness of the crime. You're not going to put somebody in prison for 8 years for shoplifting. Okay, that's not proportional. Equity. Similar crimes should be punished with the same degree of severity. That is true, but that does not always happen. Because you read in the paper and you look online and you find out all the time that people that have committed the same crime do not get the same sentence, not get the same sanctions for whatever reason, whether they're male or female, old, young, every circumstance is different. But what's interesting is the penal code, California Penal Code, gives the crime and the sentence. And it always gives the low, middle, and upper sentence. So usually in structured sentencing, the judge will sentence the person to a middle term, the midterm. If it's 2, 4, 6 years for robbery, they'll usually sentence them to 4 years, okay, depending on some circumstances, which we'll get to in a little bit. And finally, social debt. Prior records should be considered in sentencing, because if you have somebody that continues to commit crime, then their proportionality should go up in sentence, because obviously they have not learned their lesson. So structured sentencing is pretty interesting. Make sure you read about that. Pretty simple to understand. Determinate sentencing, that requires an offender to be sentenced to a fixed term. So a determinate sentence in California is 6 years, state prison. And it can be reduced by good time. Usually most folks that go to prison for a determinate sentence have 2, 4, 6 years. They usually serve about 85% of their time because they can get good time off for their good time. So basically 85%. So determinate sentencing is a set number of years. Sentencing guidelines, they are not required by law. It's usually set by the judicial branches, okay? But most times the judges follow the penal code. A presumptive sentence uses sentencing guidelines by a sentencing commission. So the presumptive sentence in the federal guidelines for trafficking rock cocaine is maybe 10 or 12 years. That's the presumptive sentence. It could go up or it could go down. Okay, and we'll talk about why these sentencing factors can go up or down. These are the reasons why sentences can be less or more. First is the aggravating circumstance. An aggravating circumstance makes the crime worse. So say somebody goes into a store with a gun to rob it. They go up to the counter, they ask for the money, point the gun at the clerk gives them the money, and then the person that robs them hits the clerk in the head with a gun, knocks him out. So that would be an aggravating circumstance because it made the robbery worse. Didn't have to hit the guy in the head, but that's what happened. So that would be an aggravating circumstance. So when the judge goes to sentence this person after a conviction, instead of 2, 4, or 6 years, they will look at the upper term of 6 years because of that aggravating circumstance. If they hadn't hit the person in the head, maybe give them 2 or 4 years. And the opposite is the mitigating circumstance. This lessens the severity of the crime. And I don't know, the book talks about maybe considered to reduce the blameworthiness of the defendant, but it calls for a lesser sentence. So a mitigating circumstance would be somebody that commits the same robbery, doesn't hit the person in the head, apologizes, and then an hour later comes back and returns the money. Okay, that would lessen the severity of the crime. That would then call for a lesser sentence. Not always, but in these circumstances, aggravating and mitigating, they're very important when it comes to sentencing. And we'll talk more about how these get to the judge in a little bit. You can read about the federal sentencing guidelines and how crack cocaine and powder cocaine were a big deal a few years ago, and how they were the disparity of those sentences were taken care of. So make sure you read about federal sentencing guidelines. The three strikes law, that is probably one of the most famous things that came out of California over the past 25 years. And basically it requires a sentence of 25 years to life for a 3-time convicted felon. So what happened in 1994 when this came out is that the third strike back then did not have to be violent. So on a rap sheet, arrest and apprehension sheet, you can look at this person having 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 felonies that are going to be looked at as a 3-strike, okay? And once they get another felony or non-felony, it could be looked at as the third strike. So when this began, the third strike did not have to be a violent crime. So literally, you had people going to prison for 25 years to life for stealing a bicycle, for stealing a set of golf clubs, or for stealing pizza. And that turned out to be not equitable, and there was a lot of disparity. So they changed that a few years ago where the third strike has to be a violent offense, which kind of makes sense. But then again, this law was used to basically stop people from committing future crimes based on their past behavior. So a lot of issues with 3 strikes. Mandatory sentencing, this is basically the structure that the judge has no say, has no latitude, has got to sentence somebody to this sentence. And so basically their third strike is mandatory. The judge cannot do anything about it. If you have a third strike case, violent felony, it's 25 years of life. The judge has no discretion. And there's other mandatory sentencing in California, like if you carjack somebody, there's a mandatory sentence. If you possess a gun during certain felonies, it's a mandatory 10-year term. If you have that gun and you display it during certain felonies, it's 15 years in prison just to display the gun. If you discharge that weapon during certain felony, it's 20 years just to discharge that weapon during certain felonies. So those are mandatory terms that the judge has no consideration other than to give them that term. So very serious stuff when it comes to mandatory sentences. So I'm not sure if there's a prison crisis today, because a lot of prisons are not to capacity. They're letting people out due to various reasons. But we'll see how that works in the next 5 years, depending on who's in the political office, depending on crime rates, depending on a lot of other things. Pre-sentence investigation, very important. Some of you, again, very soon when you graduate, you'll be working for a probation department like Sacramento County, and you will be writing the pre-sentence investigation, or the PSI. And what the probation officer does, and here in California it's done by the probation officer, not the parole agent, okay? So the probation officer prepares a very lengthy PSI written and submits it to the judge, and it helps the judge sentence somebody. So what that probation officer does is gather all information about the victim and about the person that's been convicted of that felony, and they put it together in a report, and they will detail the low, middle, or high terms that they're going to recommend to the judge to give. So sometimes these are 20 pages long, sometimes these are 40 pages long. But it's a very important document that helps the judge decide the sentence of a person. So at the end of that report, the last page says, I recommend this sentence and here's the reasons why. And guess what else is put into the PSI at the end? The aggravating and mitigating circumstances of why the decision to recommend the sentence is used. So that's where the mitigating and aggravating circumstances come in. That's why they're very important. So again, some of you will be doing these reports very soon after graduation, and there's a lot of objectivity that needs to be used in this, because you can't be subjective, you can't be involved, you have to be very objective when writing this. Some of the high risk factors in a PSI that you will be writing about is any antisocial personality patterns that the person has. What is their attitude? Do they have any social support for crime or their life outside? Do they have family issues? Do they have a house? Do they have a home to go to? Do they go to school? Do they have a job? So all these little things, plus about 15 different other things, are included in the high risk factors, okay, of the PSI. We're going to have a whole class on victimology and victim rights coming up, but read about the victims because they are not the forgotten offenders anymore. The book does a good job talking about that. The victim impact statement, basically a victim in the PSI will provide a statement to the judge before sentencing. Victims are also invited to speak at the sentencing hearing to the judge and the courtroom and the perpetrator of the crime. And these impact statements are very, very serious. And the judge gives heavy weight to what the victim says, because the victim has been victimized, whether they had their car stolen, they were robbed, whether they were raped. But it's a very big deal when the judge hears this, because they will judge their sentencing on some of the impact statement issues. The traditional sentencing options, there's basically fines, probation, imprisonment, and death, or they can be combined with probation and a fine, imprisonment and a fine. And we'll talk about these just briefly because the book does a good job talking about these. So the fines are for basically many offenders. Although there's some advantages, there's some disadvantages because some people can't pay those fines. So they may not have a job, they may be homeless, they may not be able to afford that. So there's also a system where instead of a fine, that they would go out and do community work to pay off their fine. So fines are great if they can be collected, first of all, and second, if the person can afford them. Death penalty kind of been going down. You can read about the death penalty in the book. This chapter does some pretty good work on it. Again, we're not too concerned about stats, just that the capital offense or a capital offense is a death penalty. That's what that means. Lethal injection is the most common method. There are some states that still use a firing squad, but just read about those methods. The habeas corpus review, that's basically before a death sentence is carried out, and there's several appeals that someone will receive mandatory appeals when they've been sentenced to death. So in California, the average delay is about 18 years. The book says here the average delay is about 15 years, 9 months. So that is a long time between sentencing and an execution. So that's a long time for an appeal to occur. But they're mandatory appeals, so it's a very slow process. There's a lot of opposition to capital punishment, depending on where you are at in your life, whether you're young or old. A lot of victims of crime, especially if they've had a loved one or family member killed or murdered, they are not opposed to capital punishment. Depends on your religious views. There's a lot of issues that people bring up about innocent people that have been executed. That is true. Sometimes there's lack of proven deterrence. Did the person get a deterrent sentence prior to this occurringness? Is it arbitrary? Is there discrimination involved? Is it more expensive to put somebody to death or keep them in prison for life? And again, finally, human life is sacred. So you need to choose if you're in opposition to capital punishment, and your opposition may change throughout your life depending on what happens. Death penalty and innocent people, DNA is a huge issue right now, and the Innocent Project does a great job out there of taking cases of people that have been wrongly convicted, especially in capital cases. And not all cases, though, have DNA available. So every person on death row cannot say, I want to have my case looked at for DNA, because there may not be DNA involved in the case at all. And finally, about the death penalty and deterrence, does the deterrent effect of the death penalty work? Think about this. Do you not go out and kill somebody because you're afraid of you being executed? Think about that. Does the person, before they kill somebody, say, maybe I shouldn't do this because I could be put to death? So a lot of issues with the deterrence and the death penalty. Does it work? Does deterrence work for the death penalty? Or do most people not kill other people because it's wrong, it's against their religion, it's inherently something that is not that human nature does? So interesting issues with the death penalty and deterrence. Justifications for the death penalty. There is the revenge or retribution factor. You killed somebody, therefore we will kill you. That's your just desserts. And it also is a protection for future crime that the person may commit. There's a lot of people on death row that have killed more than one person in consecutive times. They've been released from custody and they've killed someone else, and now they're on death row. So there's a lot of issues with the justification to have capital punishment. Still on the books. Governor Newsom in California, though, has put a moratorium on the death penalty while he's in office. So no inmate on death row will be put to death during his tenure as the governor. Okay, that's the review for Chapter 11, sentencing. If you have any questions or issues you want to discuss, please put on the discussion board or let me know. And with that, have a great day, and we will talk to you very soon.